And Clara Whitmore stood alone in the dirt, with ash smeared across her cheeks and her beautiful hair hacked down to nothing, praying that not a single man in that valley would look twice at her. She had made herself ugly on purpose, because pretty had nearly killed her. Because pretty meant belonging to someone who never asked permission. If you've ever had to make yourself smaller just to stay safe, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The summer of 1879 arrived in Red Hollow, Colorado, like it always did, hot, unforgiving, and loud with the sound of men making decisions that didn't belong to them. Clara Whitmore was 27 years old, and she had spent the last 6 months learning one hard truth about the frontier. A woman without land, without money, and without a man to stand in front of her was not considered a person. She was considered available. She stood inside the dim back room of the boarding house, her fingers still trembling from what she'd done that morning. The scissors lay on the floor, beside a pile of chestnut hair, her hair, the long, soft hair her mother had braided every Sunday morning before the church bells rang. Gone now, hacked off to the jaw, and her face she had rubbed ash from the cold fireplace into her skin until the natural warmth of her complexion disappeared beneath a gray, dull mask. She studied herself in the cracked mirror nailed to the wall. Nobody would want that. That was the point, Mrs. Hargrove, the boarding house keeper, appeared in the doorway and stopped cold. Clara, Lord in heaven, what have you done to yourself? What needed doing? Clara said. The older woman pressed her lips together. She looked at the hair on the floor. She looked at the ash on Clara's face. And something in her expression cracked open, not with disgust, but with a recognition that hurt worse than disgust ever could. Because Mrs. Hargrove understood. She had been young once. She had been pretty once. She knew exactly what pretty cost a woman in a town like Red Hollow. Gatherings today, Mrs. Hargrove said quietly. I know. Victor Hale is already out front. He's been asking after you. Clara's jaw tightened. He can ask all he wants. Clara, I won't be chosen by that man. Her voice didn't shake. She had practiced keeping it steady. I won't be chosen by any man who thinks choosing is something he gets to do without my say. So I'm going to stand at the end of that line, and I'm going to look like something nobody wants, and then I'm going to go home back to whatever's left of my father's land and figure out the rest on my own. Mrs. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Your father's land is gone, sweetheart. Victor Hale holds the deed. He stole it. He bought the debt. In this territory, that's the same thing. Clara turned away from the mirror. She picked up her worn coat 2 sizes too big, belonged to her father, and pulled it over her shoulders. I'll get it back, she said, but not by belonging to him. Red Hollow's annual mountain gathering was older than the town itself. It had started as a practical arrangement. Mountain men came down from their isolated ranches and homesteads, and frontier women who needed the protection and labor of a husband made their choices, or had choices made for them. Over the years, it had become something that people dressed up in nicer language. A tradition, a social occasion, a chance for community. But Clara had attended it 3 times as a spectator, and she knew what it really was. A market. The women lined up along the fence outside the general store. Some of them had dressed carefully in their best cotton dresses, their hair pinned and smoothed, their cheeks scrubbed pink. Clara understood why. She didn't judge them. When your options were limited, you used every advantage you had. She took her place at the far end of the line, as close to the corner of the fence as she could get without appearing to hide. Her coat hung loose around her shoulders. Her chopped hair sat ragged against her jaw. The ash on her face had dried into something that looked, she hoped, like the kind of grime that a woman accumulated when she had no one to help her and no reason to bother. The woman standing next to her, a widow named Bessie Crane, who had 3 children and desperate eyes, leaned slightly sideways and whispered, Clara, is that you? Don't look at me, Clara said under her breath. Just keep looking forward. What happened to your hair? Nothing. You look like you lost a fight with a sheep shearer. Good. That's exactly what I was going for. Bessie stared at her for another moment, and then slowly she nodded. She understood too. That was the terrible thing about women in Red Hollow, they all understood each other perfectly, and it had never once made anything easier. Victor Hale walked the line like he was inspecting livestock. He was not a cruel-looking man. That was the worst part. He was 60 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a dark wool coat despite the July heat. He smiled when he spoke. He tipped his hat. He used words like arrangement and partnership and mutual benefit in the same tone a minister used when reading scripture. But Clara's father had used the word predator the last time he'd been coherent enough to speak, lying in that bed with his lungs failing, and his debts stacked like firewood beside him. He'd gripped Clara's hand and said, "Don't let Hale touch this land." "Don't let him touch you," she had promised. Victor Hale reached the end of the line. He stopped in front of Clara. She kept her eyes on the ground. She kept her shoulders rounded. She was invisible. She was nobody. She was a woman who had made herself plain and forgettable and absolutely not worth his time. He studied her for a moment. Then he reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers. Her skin crawled. Every muscle in her body went rigid with the effort of not pulling away, because pulling away would make her interesting, and she could not afford to be interesting. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly, "I almost didn't recognize you." Ed, nothing. "You've let yourself go considerably." He released her chin. "I wonder if that was intentional." Still nothing. He made a small sound, not quite a laugh, and moved on down the line. Clara exhaled so slowly that no one could have seen it. Her hands, hidden in the pockets of the oversized coat, were shaking. She had gotten through it. He had moved on. She just needed to wait another hour, let the selections happen, and then slip away before anyone thought to circle back. That was the plan. The mountain cowboys came into Red Hollow just before noon. There were 8 of them. Clara had seen mountain men before, ranchers and hunters, who spent most of the year alone in the high elevations of the Rockies, coming down only when they needed supplies or, occasionally, they decided they were tired of eating alone. They came in on horseback, trail dusty and sun-weathered, and the crowd that had gathered for the day's event shifted, slightly the way a field of grass shifts when the wind changes direction. Clara barely looked up. She was counting the minutes. She was thinking about the land. She was thinking about the letter she had found in her father's things 3 months ago, a letter from a territorial land office suggesting that the sale of the Whitmore Ranch had involved falsified documentation. She hadn't known what to do with it then. She was starting to think she might know what to do with it now, if she could just get herself out of this gathering without being claimed like a piece of furniture. She heard the crowd shift again. Murmuring, a different kind of murmuring. She glanced up. One of the mountain cowboys had separated himself from the others and was walking the line. He was tall, not impossibly tall. Not the stuff of legend, but the kind of tall that you noticed because it came with weight behind it. Wide shoulders, a body that had been built by real work, not by performance. Dark brown hair, long enough to curl at the collar of his worn leather vest. A beard that hadn't been trimmed in some weeks. He moved the way men moved when they had spent a long time in places where no one was watching, without any awareness of an audience, without any performance. Just a man walking because he needed to get somewhere. His eyes moved along the line, not the way Victor Hale's eyes moved, assessing, calculating, pricing. This man's eyes moved the way a person's eyes moved when they were looking for something specific and weren't sure where they were going to find it. Clara looked down again. She heard his boots on the packed dirt. Heard him slow. She heard him stop. She did not look up. "Ma'am," his voice was low, not soft low. The difference mattered. Soft voices could disappear. This voice had the quality of a sound that you felt in your chest before you fully heard it with your ears. Clara kept her eyes on the ground. "Ma'am," he said again. "I'm talking to you." She looked up. He was closer than she'd expected. Standing maybe 3 feet away, one thumb hooked in his belt, studying her face with an expression that she couldn't immediately read. Not desire. Something more careful than either of those. You got something in your eye, he asked. She blinked. I beg your pardon. You keep looking at the ground like you dropped something. He tilted his head slightly. You lose something down there? No, she said. I'm just no. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved over her face, not the way men's eyes usually moved over her face, which was the way you looked at something you wanted to possess. He was looking at her, the way you looked at something you were trying to understand. What's your name? He asked. It doesn't matter. One corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile. More like a recognition. Most people who say that are the ones whose names matter most. She said nothing. I'm Ethan Callahan, he said. I run a ranch up past the North Ridge. Came down to find someone who knows how to work. He glanced briefly down the line. Most of the women here are dressed like they're going to church. That's fine. I'm not looking for someone to go to church. I'm looking for someone who can survive a mountain summer without falling apart. Then you should look somewhere else, Clara said. I'm not interested in being chosen. That's the most interesting thing anyone said to me all day. He didn't move. Because I don't want a man. I didn't ask if you wanted a man. His voice remained level. Completely without offense. I asked why you're not interested in being chosen. Those are two different questions. Clara stared at him. Lay waited. She said finally, carefully. Being chosen means belonging to someone. And I'm done belonging to anyone. Ethan Callahan looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, I don't need someone who belongs to me. Need someone who can pull their weight, work the land. Altitude, handle what comes. He paused. Those calloused hands of yours, you didn't get those doing needlework. She glanced down at her hands involuntarily, her working hands. Her father's daughter hands. Horses, she said, before she could stop herself. And farming, had a ranch, it's gone now. You know how to repair a fence line? The question was so unexpected that she answered it honestly, yes. Smokes a side of venison? Yes. Ride through a mountain pass in weather that would turn most people back? A pause. I've never had reason to try, but you wouldn't be afraid to. It wasn't a question. He was looking at her as though he already knew the answer and was simply waiting for her to confirm it. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was. Hope, not quite. Something smaller and more dangerous than hope. The sense that she was being seen accurately. She straightened her spine. No, she said, I wouldn't be afraid. Victor Hale appeared at Ethan's shoulder, the way smoke appeared, without warning, and with the particular quality of something that made the air round it worse. Callahan, he said pleasantly. I wasn't aware you were in the market this year. Ethan turned his head, just his head, his body stayed facing Clara. Wasn't sure I would be, Ethan said. Changed my mind. Yes. Well, Hale's smile didn't waver. I'm afraid Miss Whitmore isn't really a suitable candidate for your purposes. She's in a somewhat complicated situation at the moment. Legal matters, debt arrangements that require. Is she under contract? Ethan asked. Hale blinked. I beg your pardon. Is she legally bound to you? Yes or no. A pause. The pleasantness in Hale's expression curdled very slightly at the edges. Not formally, no. But there are arrangements in progress. Then she can make her own choice. Ethan looked back at Clara. Ma'am, do you want to come up to my ranch for the summer season? I'll pay wages. Real wages. You work, you earn your keep, you're free to go whenever you decide. No strings, no arrangements. His jaw was steady, his eyes were direct. I run a clean operation. I don't hold anyone who doesn't want to be held. The entire gathering had gone very quiet. Clara was aware of every eye on her. She was aware of Victor Hale standing 2 feet to her left, radiating a cold, controlled fury that he was working very hard to dress in polite clothing. She was aware of the women along the fence line, watching with held breath. She was aware of Bessie Crane at her elbow not moving. She was also aware of her own heartbeat, which had done something strange and inconvenient in the last 30 seconds. Looked at Ethan Callahan. She looked at his hands, large, scarred, the hands of a man who had built things and broken things, and put them back together. She looked at his face, which gave nothing away and asked nothing of her except an answer. "You said wages," she said. "How much?" He named a figure. It was fair. More than fair, it was the kind of wage that acknowledged that the work was real, and the person doing it was real. "And I can leave," she said, "whenever I choose, whenever you choose. No one would come after me." Something moved across his expression, brief and complicated. "I don't go after anyone who doesn't want to be found." She looked at Victor Hale. Hale looked back at her. The smile was still there, but his eyes said something entirely different. His eyes said, "This isn't over." His eyes said, "You still owe me." The eyes said, "You don't have anywhere to run that I can't reach." Clara looked back at Ethan. "All right," she said, "I'll come." They left Red Hollow within the hour. Ethan had a pack mule and a second horse, a steady roan mare with patient eyes, and he handed Clara the reins without comment, without assistance, without any performance of help. He simply handed her the reins as though it were the obvious thing, as though the question of whether she could manage it had never crossed his mind. She mounted without trouble. They rode out of town, side by side, and Clara did not look back. But she heard the low murmur that followed them out. She heard Victor Hale's voice somewhere in the crowd, smooth and composed, saying something she couldn't make out. She heard laughter, the comfortable laughter of people who believed they knew how a story ended before it had properly begun. She kept her eyes forward. "You don't have to pretend," Ethan said, after they had ridden far enough from town that the sounds faded. Glanced at him. "Pretend what? That you're not scared?" She considered denying it. Then she didn't. "I'm not scared of you," she said. "I didn't say you were." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He made a decision that takes the kind of nerve most people don't have. It's normal to feel it after. She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you choose me?" she asked. He rode for another 50 yards before he answered. "You were the only one who didn't want to be chosen," he said. "That told me something." "What did it tell you?" "That you know your own mind." A pause. "A person who knows their own mind doesn't become a problem. They become a partner." Clara turned this over. "You said no strings," she said. "Said had no arrangements. I meant it. Most men who say that don't mean it." "I reckon that's true." He didn't sound defensive. He sounded like a man acknowledging a fact. "I can't prove it in words. You'll have to see it for yourself." She studied the side of his face, the line of his jaw beneath the beard, the set of his eyes, the particular quality of steadiness that some people had and most people didn't. Steadiness that came not from arrogance but from having been tested and having held. Didn't trust it yet. She wasn't naive enough to trust anything that fast. But she noted it. She filed it away. The way a woman who had learned to be careful filed every piece of information for later, when she would need it. The trail into the mountains was 3 hours of climbing. Air changed as they went up, cooler, thinner, carrying the smell of pine and granite and something wild underneath it, all that Clara had no name for. The valley opened below them, and Red Hollow shrank to something that looked, from a distance, almost peaceful. It was not peaceful, she knew that. But up here, with the sky pressing down enormous and blue, and the silence between herself and this stranger comfortable enough that neither of them felt obligated to fill it, she let herself breathe for the first time in months. Ethan's ranch appeared around a bend in the trail. In the late afternoon, a solid, built structure of squared timber, a barn that was larger than the house. Fences that ran clean and tight in a way that told her they'd been maintained with real care. It was not pretty. It was built for a purpose by someone who understood what that purpose was. She liked it immediately. She was suspicious of liking it. "Bunkhouse is on the east side of the barn," Ethan said, swinging down from his horse. "It's not fancy. Clean bedding, working stove. That's fine. You eat with me or you eat alone, your choice. I cook enough for 2 either way." He looked at her. "Why what? Why do you cook enough for 2? You've been up here alone." A pause. Something moved briefly across his face there and gone before she could read it. Abbott, he said. I used to not be. He took his horse's reins and led it toward the barn. Clara stood for a moment in the late afternoon sun, holding the roan mare's reins, looking at the solid walls of that ranch, and the mountains rising behind it, and the particular quality of quiet that existed in a place where only the wind had the right of way. She thought about the letter in her saddlebag, the letter about the falsified deed. The letter that might, if she could get it to the right person, the right territorial official, give her a path back to what her father had left her. She thought about Victor Hale's eyes in that crowd. She thought about what it meant that she're at the top of the world, with a man she didn't know, having made a decision that no one in Red Hollow would call sensible. Then she led the mare into the barn, and she didn't think about sensible. She thought about the fence lines she'd seen on the way in, and what they'd need by autumn, and how much she already knew about keeping a mountain property alive through the seasons. She thought about the fact that she was here, and not there. And for now, just for now, that was enough. That first evening, Ethan made coffee and set a cup on the table without asking whether she wanted one. She wanted one. She sat working across from the Quees Ochen Berkshinsen around the tin cup and let the warmth of it seep into her palms. There are rules, Ethan said. Clara looked up. Not the kind you're thinking, he said. I'm not going to tell you where to be and when. I'm going to tell you what keeps this place running. He set his own cup down. You don't go past the north fence alone. Not yet. Mountain lion territory, you need to know the land first before you go alone. You leave that gate locked every time you come through it. No exceptions. If a storm comes in fast, you get to the barn first, horses first, then the house. Order. Horses before the house, Clara said. The house can be rebuilt. The horses are harder to replace. She nodded slowly. What else? You sleep through the night. His voice was level. I've had workers before who didn't. They burned out by August. I'm not running a military operation up here. Sleep matters. I sleep fine. All right, he picked his cup back up. Questions. She had about 40 of them. She chose one. Land to the east, she said. The lower pasture. It's not being used. He looked at her across the table. No, the fence line dips on the northeast corner. Something's been pushing at it. A pause. Elk. You could shore it up with cross stakes. Two-person job. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Saw all that writing in, he said. I was looking. Considered her for a long moment, not with surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who had expected to find something useful and had found something better. Yes, he said finally, we could do that. Clara drank her coffee. Outside, the mountains settled into dark, and the first stars appeared above the ridge, and the summer night came down around the ranch with a quiet that was nothing like the silence of a town pretending to sleep. The silence was real. She hadn't heard real silence in a long time. Ash on your face, Ethan said after a while. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his cup. None of my business, but there's a wash basin by the bunkhouse. Clara said nothing for a moment. I know, she said. Just saying it's there. I heard you. He didn't push it. Finished his coffee, stood, rinsed his cup at the basin, and said good night with the same ease he might have said it to someone he'd known for years. Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a while longer. She thought about wash her face. She thought about her father's letter in the saddlebag. She thought about Victor Hale, in his fine wool coat, watching her ride out of Red Hollow with an expression she couldn't read but understood perfectly. She thought about the northeast fence line and the cross stakes she'd need, and the work that would be required, and how work, real, physical, purposeful work, was the only thing that had ever made her feel like herself. Up, she went to the bunkhouse. She sat on the edge of the clean bunk and pulled the letter out of the saddlebag and read it in the lamplight for what must have been the 100th time, her lips moving slightly over the careful official language. Searching again for the thing she needed: the name, the date, the specific piece of evidence that would turn a suggestion into a case. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it back, and lay down on the bunk with her boots still on, and her eyes on the ceiling and the sound of the mountain night all around her. She did not wash her face, not yet, not until she understood exactly what she was safe to be here. But she let herself think, for the first time in a long time, about what it might feel like to be seen as she actually was, to have someone look at her and see not a face to be owned, or a liability to be managed, or a transaction to be completed, but a woman who knew how to repair a fence line and read a land map and work until her hands bled and still get up the next morning ready to do it again. She thought about Ethan Callahan, who had looked at her calloused hands before he'd looked at anything else. She thought maybe. Then she thought be careful. Then she closed her eyes. And outside, the mountain did what it always did. It kept its silence and held its ground and wait the way things that have always been here wait for the smaller things that are only passing through. She woke before dawn, not because something startled her. Not because the mountain made a noise it shouldn't have. Because her body had learned, over the past 2 years of surviving on instinct, that the hours before first light were the most honest hours, the ones when you couldn't pretend anymore. And the stories you told yourself in the daylight went quiet, and what was left was only the truth. The truth was this: she was 27 years old. She was sleeping in a stranger's bunkhouse, and she had made a decision the previous afternoon that could either save her life or destroy what little of it remained. She sat up, pulled on her boots, went outside. The sky above the ridge was still dark at the edges but bleeding pale in the east, that particular mountain pre-dawn that looked like the world was deciding whether or not to begin again. Clara stood in the yard with her arms crossed over her chest, and breathed the cold air in, and let it do what cold air did: sharpen everything, strip away the softness, leave only what was real. An door was already open. She walked to it. Ethan was inside, working by lamplight, running a careful hand down the foreleg of one of his horses, a dark bay gelding, that stood perfectly still under the attention, with the trust of an animal that had never been given reason to be afraid. He didn't look up when she came in. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "Slept fine," she said. "I just don't sleep long." Nodded. He'd like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. Which she supposed it was. "Coffee's on in the house," he said. "Help yourself." She didn't go get coffee. She walked to the next stall, where the roan mare she'd ridden up the mountain was standing quietly, and she ran her own hand along the mare's neck, the way her father had taught her: flat palm, steady pressure. No hesitation, and the mare turned her head and blew a warm breath against Clara's shoulder. "Her name's June," Ethan said. "She's good on a trail." "Everywhere. Smartest horse I've got." Clara kept her hand on June's neck. "How long have you been up here, on this ranch?" He straightened, moved to the next horse down the line. "Own." A pause that was barely a pause. Not always. She didn't push it. She'd learned a long time ago that when a man answered a simple question with something that sounded like it cost him something, you didn't lean on it. You let it sit. They worked in silence for a while, him finishing his rounds, her helping, without being asked, filling the water troughs, checking the latch on the hay barn. Moving through the morning routine the way she had moved through her father's barn 100 times before, the work coming back to her hands like a language she'd never quite forgotten. When they went inside for breakfast, he made eggs and didn't comment on the fact that she'd already been working for an hour. It was when she decided she could tolerate him, not trust. Not yet, but tolerate. The first week passed in the particular way that hard work made time pass quickly when you were in it, slowly when you stopped and looked back. Learned the ranch the way she'd learned everything useful in her life, by paying attention, by asking the right questions and not asking the ones that weren't her business, by finding out where the edges were and respecting them. She repaired the northeast fence line on the 3rd day. Ethan had said it was a 2-person job, and he was right. The cross stakes needed, driving at an angle that required one person to hold the guideline tie-taut while the other drove the post. They worked through the morning without talking much, and what talking there was stayed practical. Deep, what angle? whether the ground was too rocky further east to hold a stake or whether it would compact if they worked it differently. Ethan was not a man who filled silence for the sake of filling it. Clara had been around men her whole life who talked constantly, who narrated everything they did, who gave instructions before they were needed, who seemed uncomfortable with any moment in which their voice wasn't the dominant sound in the room. Ethan was not that. He spoke when he had something to say. He was quiet when he didn't, and he expected the same from whoever was working alongside him, not as a demand, but as a simple baseline, the way you expected another person to hold their end of a board without being told. It took some getting used to. She got used to it faster than she expected. On the 5th morning, she came out of the bunkhouse to find a pair of proper work gloves on the step. Her size, good leather, not the cheap kind. She stood looking at them for a moment. She picked them up, went inside, didn't mention them. At breakfast, Ethan poured coffee and said, "Gloves fit?" "Yes," she said. "Good." That was the whole conversation. She wore them every day after that. What she had not accounted for, what she had not let herself account for, because accounting for it would have required her to admit something she wasn't ready to admit, was that solitude had a sound up here. Not the solitude of being alone. The solitude of being with one other person in a place where the rest of the world couldn't reach. That was a different thing entirely. That was an intimacy that didn't announce itself. It crept in through the ordinary moments, the shared coffee before dawn, the wordless coordination of two people working the same problem from different ends. The small negotiations of the kitchen and the yard and the barn that built up, day by day, into something that felt surprisingly like being known. She caught herself thinking about it on the evening of the 7th day, sitting on the bunkhouse step with June's currycomb in her hand, and she shut the thought down hard. She was here for the summer. She was here to earn wages and figure out what to do about the letter in her saddlebag and find a way back to what Victor Hale had taken from her. She was not here to be known by anyone. She had made herself unknowable on purpose. Ash and the chopped hair and the oversized coat, she still wore them every time there was any chance of being seen by someone from the valley. Those weren't just a disguise. They were a statement, a wall, a line she'd drawn around herself that said, "This far and no further." Went to bed early. She didn't sleep for a long time. 12 days in, the trouble started. Came in the form of a rider on a gray horse, picking his way up the trail in the midday heat, moving with the particular kind of leisure that men moved with when they believed they had all the time in the world, because the world had always rearranged itself to suit them. Clara saw him from the fence line. Her hands went still on the post she'd been working. She knew the horse before she knew the rider. Victor Hale's gray, a big, fine-boned animal that cost more than most families in Red Hollow made in a year. It looked toward the house. Ethan was inside. He hadn't seen yet. For one violent second, she thought about running, about walking into the barn and getting on June and taking the north trail and disappearing into the high country before Hale reached the yard. Edna legs. She had a fast horse. She had spent the last 12 days learning where the trails went. Then she thought about the letter. Then she thought about her father's voice. Then she stood her ground. Hale pulled his horse up in the yard and swung down with the ease of a man who had never had a reason to hurry. He was alone, which surprised her. Men like Hale usually traveled with at least one other person, a foreman, a lawyer, someone to add weight to whatever they were saying. The fact that he'd come alone was either confidence or calculation, and with Victor Hale it was impossible to tell which was which. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly, like she was a neighbor he'd bumped into at a church social. "A stroke of luck, Mr. Hale." She kept her voice flat. "Mr. Callahan isn't expecting visitors." "Oh, I'm not here to see Callahan." He walked toward her with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "I'm here to see you. Just a short conversation. Won't take more than a few minutes. I have nothing to say to you. You might feel differently when you hear what I have to offer." He stopped about 10 feet away. Close enough to talk. Far enough that she couldn't call it a physical threat. He was very practiced at that distance. "I've been doing some thinking since you left town so precipitously." I've been wondering if I handled things wrong, if there's a better arrangement we could reach that serves both our interests. I'm not interested in arrangements. Your father's land is worth quite a lot, Clara. She did not let herself react. She had known this was coming. She had known since she rode out of Red Hollow that it wasn't over, that Hale didn't let things go, that the only question was how long it would take him to come up here and what shape it would take when he arrived. The land isn't yours, she said. The deed says otherwise. The deed is fraudulent. A pause. Something moved through Hale's expression, brief and cold and quickly recovered, like a crack in a wall that gets plastered over before anyone can see the structure underneath. That's a serious allegation, he said. It's the truth. Truth requires evidence, my dear. I have evidence. She hadn't meant to say it. The words came out before she'd finished thinking them through, driven by something that was part fury and part a desperate gamble, the kind of hand you played when you'd been playing defensively for so long that you forgot offense was an option. Hale went very still. In 10 years of watching Victor Hale operate in Red Hollow, Clara had never seen him go still. He was a man of constant movement, smooth, and controlled, deliberate movement, but always moving. Always adjusting, always managing, he went still. What did you say? He said quietly. The back door of the house opened. Ethan Callahan came out. He had a mug of coffee in one hand, and his eyes moved from Clara to Hale, and back to Clara in the space of 2 seconds, and whatever he read in that exchange was enough. Set the coffee on the porch railing. He walked across the yard at a pace that was not hurried and not slow, that covered the distance between them with the efficient economy of a man who had learned to handle things before they became worse than they needed to be. Hale, he said. Callahan. The smoothness returned to Hale's voice immediately, like oil on water. I was just having a friendly conversation with your Minus. She works for me, Ethan said. She's in the middle of her workday. If you have business to conduct, you conduct it with me. He stopped beside Clara, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her, in the specific way that meant something without requiring explanation. If you don't have business with me, you're welcome to ride back down the mountain. Hale looked at them both. The smile he produced was a work of art. It contained, in perfect proportion, warmth and regret, and the absolute certainty of a man who believed that he was playing a longer game than anyone else in the room. Of course, he said. He placed his hat back on his head. I apologize for the interruption. He looked at Clara one more time. We'll speak again, Miss Whitmore, when the time is right. He turned back to his horse. He mounted, he rode down the trail. And the yard was quiet again. Clara realized her hands had been balled into fists at her sides the whole time. She opened them. Ethan picked up his coffee from the porch railing and took a drink like nothing had happened. Want to tell me what that was about? He said. Not yet, she said. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Just that. All right. She turned back to the fence post. She drove the next stake with considerably more force than was strictly necessary. She told him that night. Not everything. Not the letter. Not the specific evidence she thought she had and what it would take to use it, and the particular terrifying nature of trying to prove fraud against a man who owned 3 of the 5 judges in the territory. But she told him the shape of it, her father's ranch, the debt that hadn't been as clean as Hale had made it look, the sale that had happened while her father was dying, and Clara had been the only one there to watch it happen. Ethan listened without interrupting. He sat across the kitchen table with his hands around his cup, and he listened the way some people listen, not waiting for a pause to insert their own experience, not nodding along in a way that meant he'd stopped hearing, actually tracking her, following the line of what she was saying, occasionally asking a question so precisely targeted that she understood he'd been paying attention to every word. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. How long ago? He said. 8 months. Your father, he died in February. She said it the same way she said most hard things, clean and fast, the way you pulled a splinter. 3 weeks after the sale closed. He never knew what Hale had done. I didn't tell him. I didn't want. She stopped. Swallowed. I didn't want the last thing he knew to be another thing he'd failed to protect me from. Ethan looked at his cup for a moment. You're carrying that wrong, he said. Looked up. Your father didn't fail to protect you, he said. A man came for him while he was dying, and he didn't have the means to fight it. That's not the same thing. His voice was even, matter of fact. Not consoling, he didn't have the particular softness that consolation required, and she suspected he knew that about himself. Nan, and you went out there alone, and you've been fighting it since. That's the right thing to carry. Clara sat with that for a moment. The evidence I mentioned, she said carefully. I have a letter. A territorial land office. It suggests the sale documentation had irregularities. What kind of irregularities? The kind that require a signature my father couldn't have given. He was bedridden for 3 weeks before the sale. His hand, she stopped again. A pen. Ethan was very still. You have that in writing? He said. Mills. From the land office? The letter doesn't say it that directly. It says the documentation requires review. But if I could get it to the right federal official. Not territorial, he said immediately. She looked at him. Territorial judges here are Hales, he said. You know that. Federal Circuit, maybe. Or the Land Commission office in Denver. He set his cup down. I know a man. Used to work for the Federal Surveying Service. Retired now, lives down near Buena Vista. If the documentation is what you say it is, he'd know where to take it. Sarah stared at him. You'd help me with this? She said. He seemed slightly puzzled by the question. You just told me a man stole your father's land while your father was dying, he said. What else would I do? She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at him across the table, this quiet, weathered man with the careful hands and the even voice and the particular quality of stillness that she had been studying for 12 days, without letting herself think too hard about why, and she felt something crack open in her chest, small and controlled, like the first hairline fracture in ice when the temperature finally changes. She looked back down at the table. I'll think about it, she said. All right, he said. He got up, rinsed his cup, said goodnight. She sat at the table after he'd gone and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed. Yacht, be careful, she thought. He helped because he's decent, not because he wants something. She thought, those two things are not mutually exclusive, and you need to figure out the difference. She thought about Victor Hale's face when she'd said she had evidence. That stillness, that crack in the plaster. She thought, you just told him you have a weapon. You're up here on a mountain, with one man between you and the rest of the valley. Then she thought, that man just stood beside you, without asking a single question first. She didn't know what to do with that. She went to bed and she lay in the dark, and she thought about what it meant to be in debt to someone you didn't know how to stop noticing. Next morning, she washed her face. Not because she had decided anything, not because she felt safe. She washed her face because the ash was starting to irritate her skin, and because she had, over the past 12 days, come to believe that Ethan Callahan was not a man who would change his behavior based on what she looked like. Nay. She had been watching for it, for the particular shift that happened, when men realized the woman they were dealing with was not the version they'd initially assessed. She had been watching for the calculation, the recalibration, the subtle rearrangement of how he spoke to her and what he expected. It hadn't come, because he hadn't known what she looked like. Because he genuinely had not been looking, she stood over the wash basin and worked the grime off her face and looked at herself in the small square mirror above it. Her face looked back, her real face, the face her mother had called a blessing, and her father had called trouble, and Victor Hale had looked at like a deed he intended to file. She dried off. Started the morning feed. Ethan came in 20 minutes later, stopped briefly, and looked at her. Waited, he said. June's left shoe looks like it might need resetting. I was going to check it this afternoon. I noticed yesterday, she said. I already checked it. It can wait another week if we watch it. He nodded, that was all. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and went back to work. It was Bessie Crane, who brought the real trouble. She arrived on a Tuesday 10 days after Hale's visit. 23 days into Clara's time on the mountain, riding up the trail on a borrowed horse, with her 3 children stacked behind her, like luggage, and her face carrying the specific expression of a woman who had run out of choices and was now operating on pure desperate momentum. Clara saw her coming from the yard, and her stomach dropped. Essie. She walked to the gate. What happened? Esty swung down from the horse, with the mechanical motion of someone running on nothing. Eldest, a boy of about 12, helped the efficient two down with a practiced efficiency that told Clara everything she needed to know about what life had been like for this family. Dale took my house, Bessie said. Her voice was flat, wrung out. 3 days ago, I had 2 weeks on the rent. He sent his men and they put our things in the street. She looked at Clara with the particular hollowness of a person who has been humiliated past the point of being able to feel it properly. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Clara looked at the children. The youngest was maybe 5. She had a doll Mrs. One Arm tucked under her own arm, and she was watching Clara with large, serious eyes. Come inside, Clara said. I don't want to cause trouble for you. Come inside, Bessie. Ethan appeared from the direction of the barn. He took in the situation, the woman, the children, the borrowed horse, luggage tied to the back in about 3 seconds. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. Bunkhouse has a second room, he said. Been using it for storage. I'll clear it out this afternoon. Bessie stared at him. He said, Your boy looks like he can work. I could use an extra hand with the south fencing. The 12-year-old straightened. Bessie pressed her lips together hard. Her eyes were doing something she was clearly fighting to prevent. We can pay, she said. Once you can pay with the work, Ethan said. That's how it goes up here. He turned and walked back to the barn. I'll start on the storage room. Clara looked at Bessie. Bessie was watching Ethan walk away with an expression that Clara understood completely. Because she'd had a version of it herself 3 weeks ago, the look of a person who has been so prepared for the worst that they have no idea what to do with something that isn't. Means it, Clara said quietly. I know, Bessie said. Her voice cracked slightly on the 2 words. She pulled it back together. I can see that. Bessie's presence changed the rhythm of the ranch, and it changed Ethan in ways that Clara watched carefully. He was not, she discovered, a man who was good with children, the way some men were good with children, instinctive, effortless, easy. He was good with them the way he was good with most things, by paying attention, by giving them real tasks and real responsibility, by treating what they said as worth responding to. Bessie's boy, whose name was Thomas, attached himself to Ethan with the particular intensity of a 12-year-old who had not had a man take him seriously in a very long time. Ethan handled that with a care that was so undemonstrative, it took Clara several days to recognize it as care. She came around the corner of the barn one afternoon to find Thomas struggling with a piece of fence hardware, a lever mechanism that required more hand strength than he currently had, and Ethan crouched down beside him, not doing it for him, not taking it over, just adjusting the boy's grip slightly and saying, try it from the wrist, not the palm. You've got more leverage that way. Thomas tried it. The mechanism gave. The expression on the boy's face was something Clara looked away from, because it was too much to look at directly. She went back to what she'd been doing. That evening she sat on the bunkhouse step while Bessie's youngest, the girl with the one-armed doll, H, sat beside her and told her, at considerable length, about the doll's name, which was Margaret, and Margaret's many adventures, and the specific things that Margaret liked to eat, which were, apparently, biscuits and also berries. Clara listened to all of it. She couldn't have said her the way it did this, small child's complete, unguarded willingness to share the world of her imagination with a stranger. Maybe because she'd spent so long being careful about what she shared. Maybe because she'd forgotten that trust, for some people, hadn't been trained out of them yet. What happened to Margaret's arm, she asked. The girl, her name was Ruth, considered this seriously. She was brave, she said, and sometimes brave costs something. Clara was very still for a moment. That's right, she said. It does. Ruth nodded, satisfied with this confirmation, and went back to telling Margaret about the mountains. It was Bessie who finally said what had been building between them. 2 weeks after her arrival, when the children were asleep and Ethan had said good night and gone inside, she and Clara sat outside in the summer dark with cups of cold coffee and the particular silence of two women who had known each other long enough to stop needing small talk. Like him, Bessie said. Clara didn't pretend she didn't know who Bessie meant. A good man, she said. That's not what I said. I'm not judging you. Lord knows you deserve something good after everything. She turned her cup in her hands. I'm just noting it. 'Cause I see how you look when you think no one's watching, and I see how he looks at you, and I think you'd both be better off if someone said it out loud. How's he look at me? Clara asked, and hated herself slightly for asking. Essie was quiet for a moment. Like you're something he found that he thought he'd lost the right to find, she said. Clara looked at the dark mountains. That's a complicated thing, she said. Men. All the real things are, said Bessie. They sat there until the cold drove them inside, and Clara lay in the dark and thought about what Bessie had said. He turned it over. She examined it from different angles, looking for the places where it was wrong or wishful or dangerous. She couldn't find as many as she wanted. What she found instead, unwelcome and undeniable, was the memory of Ethan's voice 12 days ago. You're carrying that wrong. I'm sorry. Not how terrible for you. Not the reaching, performing sympathy that people used when they wanted credit for their compassion. Just, you're carrying it wrong, and here's why. Like she was someone whose thinking was worth correcting. Like, she was someone who could handle the correction. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She thought about the letter in the saddlebag. She thought about Hale's stillness in the yard. She thought about the federal contact in Buena Vista and whether she was brave enough to set that in motion and what it would mean if she did. She thought, he's patient now because the summer's long and nothing has come due yet. She thought, when it comes due, that's when you'll find out what you're actually dealing with. Then she thought, you already know. And that was the most frightening thing she'd thought all summer. Because she was starting to believe it. 3 days after Bessie said what she said, Clara made a decision. Not about Ethan. She wasn't ready to make decisions about Ethan. The decision she made was about the letter about the evidence in her saddlebag that she'd been carrying for 8 months like a coal in her pocket, burning a hole through everything but never quite setting anything on fire. She took it out in the early morning before anyone else was awake. She spread it flat on the bunkhouse floor and read it one more time, every word, in the thin gray light coming through the single window. Then she folded it back along its creases, tucked it inside her coat, and walked to the house. Ethan was already at the stove. He heard her come in and said, without turning around, coffee's ready. I want to go to Buena Vista, she said. He turned around. She put the letter on the table. He crossed to it, picked it up, read it. He read slowly, not because he was a slow reader, she had already figured out, but because he was the kind of man who didn't move through a document until he understood it. Then he set it down. This is enough, he said. If you get it to the right person, this is enough. Is your contact still there? The one from the Federal Surveying Service? Asked, I heard. He looked at her steadily. You ready to do this? I've been ready for 8 months, she said. I just didn't have anywhere safe to move from. Something crossed his face at that brief, controlled, contained the way he contained most things. Nodded. We can leave day after tomorrow, he said. I need to arrange for Thomas to handle the morning feed. I can go alone, I know you can. He picked up the coffee pot. But you're not going alone. She looked at him. Hale knows you have this now, he said. You told him. That was brave and also meant that you burned your cover. Won't sit on that. He poured 2 cups and set one on the table for her. You go down that mountain alone and there's too many places between here and Buena Vista where you disappear, and nobody knows to look. Clara sat down. She hated that he was right. She hated more that the reason she hated it was not because she thought he was wrong, but because accepting his help meant accepting that she needed it, and she had spent 8 months trying to prove, at least to herself, that she didn't need anyone. All right, she said. All right, he said. He sat down across from her and they drank their coffee in the quiet morning. And Clara thought that this was perhaps the most ordinary dangerous thing she had ever done, made a plan at a kitchen table, with a man she trusted, setting something in motion that couldn't be taken back. They left before dawn on Thursday. Bessie stood in the yard with Thomas and the two little ones, and watched them go with an expression that Clara couldn't look at directly, because it contained too much hope, and too much worry, all of it on Clara's behalf, and Clara wasn't accustomed to being worried about by someone who had their own problems large enough to justify not worrying about anyone else at all. That back, Bessie said. Simple, direct. We'll be 3 days, Clara said. Outside, I know. Bessie looked at her. Come back anyway. They rode down the mountain in the gray pre-dawn, and the trail was familiar to Clara now in a way it hadn't been when she'd first come up it 6 weeks ago. She knew where it switched back. She knew where it ran close to the drop on the east side, and you needed to keep your horse's head angled in. She knew where the stream crossing was, and how deep it ran in July. Knowing the land had always steadied her. Her father had taught her that. Know your ground, Clara. Know your ground before you need to run on it. She knew this ground now. Ethan rode beside her and slightly ahead when the trail narrowed, and she noticed he kept his eyes on the switchbacks below, rather than the valley. Scanning the lower trail with the particular attention of a man who had spent enough time in wild country to understand that the danger was usually where you weren't looking yet. They were 2 hours down the mountain when he said, "We've got company." She heard it before she saw it, the sound of horses on the trail below, coming up, not quickly but not slowly either. The deliberate pace of men who knew where they were going. 3 riders, coming from the direction of Red Hollow. Ethan pulled up his horse and put his arm out, and Clara stopped June beside him. They sat still in the early morning light, watching the riders come up through the trees. She recognized the man in front before she recognized his face. She recognized him by the way he sat a horse like. He owned the horse, the trail, and everything the trail passed through. Dr. Hale, and beside him, 2 men she didn't know. Large, both wearing sidearms. How did he know? She said low. He's been watching the road, Ethan said. His voice was quiet. Completely even. He's had someone watching this trail since he came up here 3 weeks ago. I should have accounted for that. You couldn't have. I should have. Stay behind me. I will not. Clara. He turned and looked at her directly. Not because you can't handle it. Because if this goes sideways, I need to know where you are. That's not protection, that's tactics. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she moved June back a half length. Hale pulled up 20 feet away. His 2 men spread slightly to either side, the way men spread when they'd been told to cover angles. Callahan, Hale said, pleasantly, always pleasantly. Early morning for a long ride. We've got business in Buena Vista, Ethan said. Mind moving your horses off the trail? You're blocking the path. I'll only take a moment of your time.
Hale's eyes moved to Clara.
He looked at her real face. No ash, no disguise, and something moved through his expression that she didn't like. Not desire, calculation. Miss Whitmore, I was hoping we'd have a chance to finish our conversation from the other week. There's nothing to finish, Clara said. On the contrary, he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I have here a judgment from Judge Harlan's court regarding outstanding debt on the former Whitmore property. It names you specifically as the party responsible for the balance your father left unpaid. He held it up. Not offering it, displaying it, the judgment authorizes me to collect in whatever form the court deems appropriate. Clara's hands tightened on June's reins. She knew about Judge Harlan. One of Hale's judges, one of the 3. That judgment is based on fraudulent documentation, she said. And I have evidence of the fraud. Hale smiled. Courts tend to credit documentation over allegations, Miss Whitmore, especially when the documentation in question has been filed, processed, and upheld at the territorial level. He put the paper back in his coat. Hey, whatever you think you have, and I doubt it amounts to much, it won't matter if you're detained while the matter is reviewed. These things take time, months, perhaps longer. You're going to detain her, Ethan said. His voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, something more fundamental. It had gone very flat, the way a river went flat before it dropped off something. On a mountain trail, with 2 hired men. I'm going to ask her to return to Red Hollow to address the judgment, Hale said. Voluntarily, and if she doesn't, then my associates here are authorized by the court to ensure compliance. Silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. Felt longer. Ethan swung down from his horse. Clara's heart slammed once hard. Hale's 2 men shifted. Ethan walked forward, not toward the men, toward Hale's horse. He stopped at the animal's head and looked up at Hale, with an expression that Clara, watching from behind, couldn't fully see but could read entirely from the way Hale's face changed. Victor, Ethan said, quiet as a closed door. I want you to think carefully about what you're doing right now. You rode up here with 2 hired men to stop a woman from taking documentation to a federal contact in Buena Vista. That's what this is. And if anything happens to her on this trail, or if she gets detained on a territorial judgment while I'm standing here watching, I'm going to ride directly to Denver, and I'm going to personally put everything she has in front of the Federal Land Commission. He paused. And you know what they'll find. Hale's pleasant expression had gone very careful. You're a mountain cowboy, he said. You have no standing in territorial court matters. No, Ethan said. But I've got standing with the Federal Surveying Commission, because I worked with them for 2 years back in Seftiwaiwan. And I've got a contact in the Denver Land Office who I've known for 15 years. Another pause. And I've got a very clear memory of where I was on the 14th of September, 1878, which was the date on James Whitmore's sale documentation. And what I was doing on that date was helping pull a man out of a river, 200 miles from Red Hollow. He looked straight at Hale. Man by the name of Whitmore. Too sick to hold a pen. Too sick to sign his name to anything. The mountain went completely quiet. Clara stopped breathing. She had not known that. She had not known that Ethan had known her father. Ray. She had not known that Ethan had been there, wherever there was, on the day the fraud had been committed. She had not known that the man she'd been living alongside for 6 weeks was, in some way she was only now understanding, already part of this story. Hale looked at Ethan for a long moment. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was not rage. It was worse than rage. It was the cold, controlled expression of a man recalculating moving pieces on a board that had suddenly changed shape. Ethan said, "We will," Ethan said. In Denver, Hale turned his horse. His 2 men fell in beside him. They rode back down the trail, and the sound of their horses faded, and the morning came back in birdsong, wind, the smell of pine and warm rock. Clara sat on June and stared at Ethan's back. He turned around. "Ace, you knew my father," she said. "Yes." "You knew about the fraud. I knew something was wrong. I didn't have the full picture until I read your letter." He walked back to his horse. "I pulled your father out of the Platte River in September of '78. He was trying to get back to Red Hollow. He'd heard Hale was moving on the property. He was sick, the lung sickness, already past the point." He stopped. Mounted. "He wasn't going to make it. We both knew that. He asked me to look in on you if I ever had reason to come through Red Hollow." Clara's throat had closed. "He asked you to look in on me," she said. "He did. And when you came to the gathering, I came looking for you, specifically." He looked at her steadily. "I knew your name. I knew your face from what he told me. When I saw you at the end of that line with ash on your face and your hair cut off and your shoulders set like you were ready to fight the whole world alone." He paused. "I figured you'd earned the right to know someone was on your side." She pressed her lips together. She would not cry on this mountain trail. She had made that decision in February, and she had kept it, and she was going to keep it now. Should have told me, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. Yes, he said simply. I should have. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because you needed to be on your own terms first, he said. Your father told me you were proud and stubborn and would fight anyone who tried to help you before you were ready to be helped. He said it like he was proud of you for it. A pause. I thought if I told you straight off who I was and why I'd come, you'd run. He stopped. She waited. I wanted you to trust me before you knew you had a reason to, he said. I wanted it to be real. The morning moved around them. Somewhere above, a hawk crossed the sky. Clara thought about her father in the Platte River. She thought about him sick and trying to get home, asking a stranger to look after the daughter he'd failed to protect. She thought about that stranger carrying that request for nearly a year, and then showing up at a town gathering and choosing the one woman who didn't want to be chosen. She thought about what love looked like when it came through other people, when it kept moving after the person who sent it was gone. All right, she said. Her voice was rough. We need to get to Buena Vista. We do, he said. They rode. The man in Buena Vista was named Gerald Marsh, and he lived in a small house at the edge of town with a garden that had gotten away from him, and a dog that hadn't. He opened the door in his shirt sleeves. Took one look at Ethan and said, "Hey, Callahan." You look terrible. You look older, Ethan said. Come in. Marsh stepped back. His eyes moved to Clara with the alert, assessing look of a man who had spent his career reading documents and people with equal precision. Who's this? Clara Whitmore, Ethan said. Her father was James Whitmore, rancher out of Red Hollow. Something shifted in Marsh's expression. As he said, February, Clara said. Marsh looked at her for a moment. He opened the door wider. Come in and sit down, he said. Both of you. Clara put the letter on Marsh's kitchen table. Eat it standing, which told her something about him. Then he went to a shelf and came back with a ledger, old, thick, filled with handwritten entries going back years. He found what he was looking for and set it beside the letter. He looked at both documents for a long time. The sale documentation for the Whitmore property, he said, finally, was filed with the territorial office on the 17th of September 1878. He looked up. 3 days after the date on the deed itself. The deed is dated the 14th, Clara said. My father was in the Platte River on the 14th. 200 miles from Red Hollow, Ethan said. I was with him. Marsh looked at Ethan. You'd testify to that, he said. In any court that would hear it. Marsh closed the ledger. He was quiet for a moment. This isn't a territorial matter anymore, he said. A fraudulent land claim involving falsified federal documentation that goes to the Federal Land Commission. Yale's judges don't touch it. He looked at Clara. If I write up what I have here and attach your letter and Callahan's witness statement, I can get this to the Denver office within the week. He paused. It won't be fast. These things take months, but it'll hold. And while it's under federal review, Hale can't move on the property. Any action he takes against you becomes contempt. Clara sat very still. It'll hold, she said. If what you're telling me is true, and I believe it is, yes. It'll hold. She put both hands flat on the table. She breathed. She had been carrying the weight of this for 8 months. She had carried it through her father's death and through 6 months of Red Hollow looking at her like she was a problem to be solved by whoever claimed her first. She had carried it up a mountain and into a stranger's kitchen and along a trail where Victor Hale had ridden out with 2 armed men to stop her. And now a man in a garden-gunneled house in Buena Vista was telling her it would hold. Thank you, she said. Her voice was almost steady. Don't thank me yet, Marsh said. He was already reaching for paper and pen. Let's get it written down. They rode back toward the mountain the next morning. They stayed at separate rooms in the Buena Vista boarding house, a detail that Clara had half expected Ethan to manage differently, and that he managed exactly as she'd expected when she was honest with herself about what kind of man he was. Ate her a room key. He said breakfast was at 6. He said good night. He went to his room. She lay in the boarding house bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything she now knew that she hadn't known yesterday morning. She thought about her father, asking a stranger to look after her. She thought about what it meant that her father, proud, private, fiercely protective of his independence, had been willing to ask that. She thought about how afraid he must have been, not for himself, for her. She thought about Ethan carrying that request for 10 months and then walking into a town gathering and standing in front of the one woman who had made herself impossible to want and choosing her. She thought he deceived you. She thought he protected you. She thought, those two things can be true at the same time, and you need to figure out what you're going to do with that. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. They were 3 hours from home when the storm came in. In storms, in July, move the way nothing else moved, fast, absolute, with no negotiation. One moment the sky was blue and the next it had gone the color of a bruise, and by the time Clara felt the first cold gust off the ridge, the thunder was already close enough to feel in her chest. Ethan pulled up his horse and looked at the sky for about 2 seconds. "There's a line check half a mile east," he said. "We go now, we make it." Rode hard. The rain hit before they reached it, not the beginning of a storm rain, but the full weight of it, the kind of mountain rain that was cold as November even in July and came sideways with the wind behind it. Clara leaned over June's neck and let the mare run, trusting the horse's footing on ground she knew better than Clara did. The shack was small and solid and had been maintained by someone not recently, but well enough. They got the horses into the attached lean-to and themselves through the door before the worst of it hit. Then they stood in the dim interior, listening to the rain come down on the roof, with the sustained roar of something that wasn't planning to stop any time soon. Clara pushed her wet hair out of her face. Ethan found a lantern, found matches in a tin on the shelf, got a light going. It was a very small space. She sat on the bench against the wall, and he crouched at the small iron stove and built a fire from the wood stacked beside it. Storm pressed against the walls. The lantern made the space smaller, warmer, more immediate. "My father," she said. "Did he know he was dying when you pulled him out of that river?" Ethan settled back and looked at the stove. "Yes," he said. "Did he talk about me?" A pause. "He talked about you like you were the most capable person he'd ever met," Ethan said. "Also like he was terrified he'd failed you." He looked at her. "Both of those things at the same time, which told me he knew you pretty well." Looked at her wet hands. "He didn't fail me," she said. "No," Ethan said. "He didn't." The fire caught. The heat began to move outward into the small room. "Why didn't you tell me you knew him?" she said, not angry. "Tired. Weeks ago. When you first, why didn't you just say it?" He was quiet for a moment. "The night you told me about the land, you said you didn't tell your father about Hale's fraud because you didn't want the last thing he knew to be another thing he'd failed to protect you from." He looked at her steadily. "I thought about that for a long time, about what it costs a person to carry something alone, because they don't want the people they love to feel the weight of it." He paused. "I thought maybe you needed to stand on your own ground for a while, before you knew the ground had always been yours." Clara looked at him across the small, warm space. The rain was very loud. "That's a complicated thought," she said. "I'm a complicated person." "You're really not," she said. "That's what threw me." He looked at her. "You're exactly what you look like," she said. "And I'm not used to that." A silence that was different from the other silences. "Clara," he said. And the way he said it, not asking anything, not reaching for anything. Just her name in his voice, like it was something he was setting down carefully, did something to her chest that she was done pretending it didn't do. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were, maybe," he held her gaze, "but not until you're ready." "And you're not ready yet." She looked at him for a long moment. "Anne, how do you know?" she said. "Because you're still deciding whether to trust me," he said. "And you should be. I kept something from you for 6 weeks." "You're right to weigh that." He turned back to the stove. "I'm not going anywhere. The weighing can take as long as it needs." She sat with that. Outside, the storm did what storms did, spent itself against the mountain, pushed everything it had against something that was older and more patient, and eventually, inevitably, exhausted itself. Rain slowed. The thunder moved east. Clara listened to it go. "My father asked you to look after me," she said. "He did. And you think you've done that?" "I think I've tried to." He glanced at her. "Nah. I think you've looked after yourself considerably more than I've looked after you. I mostly just tried not to get in the way." Despite everything, the rain, the exhaustion, the weight of the day, and the revelation on the trail, and the grief that had reopened in ways she hadn't planned, she almost smiled. Almost. "There's something you should know," she said. He waited. "I washed my face 6 weeks ago because I believed you were a man who wouldn't change how he looked at me based on what I looked like." She held his gaze. "I was right about that. I wasn't wrong about that." Ethan looked at her. "No," he said quietly, "you weren't." "I need you to know that I know the difference," she said, "between a man who helps because he was asked to and a man who helps because." She stopped. "Again, I need to know which one this is, before anything else." "Need to know." The stove ticked. The last of the rain ran down the roof. Ethan was quiet for a long time. "Your father asked me to look in on you," he said. "That's how it started." He met her eyes. "That's not how it is now." The words landed exactly the way words landed, when they were true, not loudly, not dramatically, just with the simple weight of something that couldn't be argued with. Clara breathed. "All right," she said. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't look away either. Nah. And outside, that storm passed over and moved on. Oh, the way all things passed that weren't strong enough to stay, leaving behind the clean, cold, particular smell of July rain on high-altitude granite, the smell of something washed clear and ready to begin. They rode back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that had changed its quality. Not the quiet of two people who didn't know each other. Not the careful quiet of the first weeks, when Clara had been measuring every silence for what it might contain. This was the quiet of two people who had said something true and were now living in the space that truth had opened up, neither of them rushing to fill it with anything less than what it deserved. Bessabai met them in the yard the moment they came through the gate. She took one look at Clara's face, not the wet hair or the trail dust or the exhaustion, and said, "It went through." "Not yet," Clara said, "but it will." Bessie pressed her lips together and nodded hard, the way people nodded when they were fighting something behind their eyes. Then she turned and went back to the house and called the children in for supper. And that was that. Thomas took the horses without being asked. Ethan watched him go and said nothing, but Clara caught the particular quality of his silence, the kind that meant something had settled right. To the bunkhouse. She changed out of her wet clothes. She sat on the edge of the bunk and pressed her hands together between her knees and thought about Gerald Marsh in Buena Vista, writing up everything he had. Attaching the letter, attaching Ethan's witness account, sending it up the chain to Denver. She thought about the Federal Land Commission. She thought about months. It would take months. Marsh had been clear about that. These things moved slowly. The law moved slowly when it wasn't being pushed by someone like Victor Hale, and when it was being pushed against someone like Victor Hale, it moved slower still. Because men like Hale had spent decades learning how to use the law's own weight against it. Old. But she believed that. She was not certain she had believed anything this strongly since before her father got sick. She lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel it, the particular mix of exhaustion and relief, and something underneath both of those that she wasn't ready to name yet, but that had the quality of warmth. Of ground underfoot that wasn't shifting. She was asleep before she finished the thought. Victor Hale's next move came 11 days later, and it didn't come up the mountain. It came through the town. Clara found out about it the way she found out about most things that happened in Red Hollow through Bessie, who had gone down to the trading post for supplies and come back with a face that told the story before her mouth did. "He's calling in favors," Bessie said, setting her basket on the kitchen table. He went to the families. The ones who owe him money, which is half the valley. He's telling them that the Callahan Ranch is sheltering a woman who's filing fraudulent federal claims against a legitimate territorial land transaction. She looked at Clara. He's using the word fraudulent about you. Clara didn't move. She said, "More than I'd like." Bessie sat down. The Hendersons pulled their grazing agreement with Ethan. The Coopers said they won't send their boy up here for the fall fencing work. She paused. And Reverend Marsh, not Gerald Marsh, the other one, in Red Hollow gave a sermon on Sunday about women who stir up trouble and call it justice. The kitchen was very quiet. "Is Ethan losing business over this?" Clara said. "Is he losing business?" Bessie looked at her directly. "Yes." Clara got up from the table. She found Ethan at the south fence, working alone where Thomas usually worked beside him, and she understood immediately that Thomas had been kept at the ranch because Ethan already knew. She didn't ease into it. "You're losing contracts," she said. "Some, because of me, because of Hale." He drove a stake and didn't look up. "A difference." "Ethan, I know what you're going to say." "Then save me the breath and tell me your answer." He stopped, straightened, looked at her with the full direct attention he gave everything when he decided it deserved it. My answer is that I've been up on this mountain for 6 years doing business, with people who take Hale's money and jump when he tells them to," he said. "Andersons, the Coopers, half the valley. I've been civil. Being civil was easier than not being civil, and nothing had come due yet." He looked at her steadily. "Something's come due now, and I'd rather know who these people are than keep pretending they're something different." Clara held his gaze. "You could lose everything," she said. "I've already lost everything once," he said. "I know how to build it back." He picked up the next stake. "What I won't do is let Hale use my business agreements to put pressure on you." That's what he's doing. He can't get to you directly, not with a federal review pending, so he's trying to isolate you by cutting off anyone who might stand beside you. I know what he's doing. Then stop looking at me like you're responsible for it. It hit him. He looked back. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met," she said. "I reckon that's probably true," he said, and went back to work. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she picked up the other end of the guideline and held it taut, and they worked the rest of the afternoon in a silence that was by now the most comfortable kind of language either of them had. The letter from Denver arrived on a Thursday 31 days after Gerald Marsh had sent the file. It came through the Red Hollow post, which meant it passed through 3 sets of hands before it reached the mountain, any one of which might have mentioned it to anyone who might have mentioned it to Victor Hale. Clara understood this the moment she held it. She understood it before she opened it. She opened it at the kitchen table with Ethan and Bessie and all 3 of Bessie's children present. Stopped, it's alone in this, and she was done pretending otherwise. The letter was from the Federal Land Commission office in Denver. She read it once. Then she set it down and put her hand flat on the table and breathed. "Clara," Bessie said. "They've opened a full investigation," Clara said. "Sale of the Whitmore property has been suspended pending federal review. No transfers, no actions against the property or its heirs can be taken while the investigation is active." She looked up. "They want a formal deposition from Ethan in Denver." Within 30 days, the room was very quiet. Then Ruth, 5 years old, missing nothing, said, "Does that mean the bad man can't take your house?" Clara said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "That's what it means." Ruth nodded. "Good," she said, and went back to her biscuit. "Yeah." Thomas let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding since the letter appeared. Bessie reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. Ethan read the letter himself, carefully, from top to bottom. When he finished, he set it down. 30 days is enough time, he said. "I can be in Denver in 3 days each way. We need to tell Marsh," Clara said. "He should know it went through. I'll send a wire from Red Hollow tomorrow." He looked at him. "You'd go to Red Hollow. I've been going to Red Hollow my whole life." He looked back. "Hale's people can see me walk in and wire Gerald Marsh." Let them. The deliberateness of it hit her. He was not hiding. He had never been hiding. He had been a man who lived up on a mountain because he chose to, not because he was afraid of what was below, and now he was choosing to walk into Victor Hale's town and send a telegram in plain sight and let everyone draw their own conclusions. She understood something then about the specific kind of courage that wasn't loudness or performance. The kind that was just continuity, doing the same thing in the same way, regardless of who was watching. Father had had it. She had it. She hadn't expected to find it in someone else. The twist came the next morning. Ethan came back from Red Hollow in the early afternoon, sooner than Clara had expected, and she knew something had happened before he dismounted, because he rode into the yard at a pace that was not his usual pace, not fast, neat, not alarmed. Purposeful, in a way that meant the situation had changed. He came into the kitchen. He put a second letter on the table. That was waiting for me at the post office," he said. "Addressed to you. Sent from a law firm in Denver." Clara picked it up. The return address was Alderman and Cole, attorneys at law. She had never heard of them. She opened it. She read 3 sentences. Then she sat down. "Clara." Ethan's voice was careful. "Is it?" She looked up. "My father," she said. "Before he died. Before Hale moved on the property." She looked back at the letter. "He filed a separate deed claim, through a federal land agent. He filed it in my name." She could hear her own voice doing something strange, going thin at the edges, like paper held up to light. "He filed it the week before Hale showed up with the debt. He knew what was coming." She pressed her lips together hard. "Knew. And he filed the land in my name through a federal agent, which means it bypassed the territorial system entirely, which means It means Hale's sale was fraudulent twice over," Ethan said quietly. "It means the land was already mine," she said, "legally. Any of this happened before my father died. The Whitmore Ranch is mine by federal deed, and has been for nearly a year, and Victor Hale knew it. He had to have known it, and he filed the territorial sale anyway." The room went very still. Ethan sat down. They looked at each other across the table. "He'd just commit fraud," Clara said. "He committed federal land fraud with full knowledge of an existing deed." "That's not a review, that's a crime." "Yes," Ethan said. "He's not losing the property claim," she said. "He's losing everything." A pause. "If you're willing to take it that far," Ethan said carefully. She looked at him. "Are you asking me if I want to protect a man who took my father was dying and then spent the next 8 months treating me like something he was owed?" she said. "No," Ethan said. "I'm asking you if you're ready for what happens next." As what happens next gets loud and ugly, and it involves standing up in rooms full of people and saying true things that powerful people don't want said. He held her gaze. "I want to know you're ready for that, not whether you're right." "Right, whether you're ready." Clara thought about her father in that river. She thought about the gathering in Red Hollow and the end of the line and the ash on her face. Nay, she thought about Bessie's things in the street, and Ruth's one-armed doll, and Thomas learning to work a fence lever with his wrist instead of his palm. She thought about every woman in Red Hollow who understood each other perfectly and had never once been able to do anything about it. "I've been ready since February," she said. Ethan nodded. "Let's get it done," he said. They went to Denver together. Clara had never been to Denver. She had lived her entire life in the frontier territory, first on her father's ranch, then in Red Hollow's margins, then on Ethan's mountain. Denver was the largest city she had ever walked through, and she walked through it the way she walked through everything now, with her eyes up, and her shoulders straight and her working hands visible, making no apologies for what she looked like or where she'd come from. The Land Commission offices were in a federal building on the main street, and they smelled of paper and ink and the specific authority of institutions that had been in place long enough to believe themselves permanent. The commissioner was a man named Arthur Delaney, 50 years old, wire-rimmed spectacles, the careful precision of someone who had built a career on getting details right. He read everything they brought him. He read the letter from Clara's father's attorney. Read the federal deed filing. He read Gerald Marsh's report and Ethan's witness account. He had all of it without saying a word. When he finished, he took off his spectacles and set them on the desk. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to ask you a direct question and I need a direct answer." "Go ahead," she said. "Did you or anyone acting on your behalf have prior knowledge of the federal deed filing before receiving this letter?" "No," she said. "I knew my father had tried to protect the land. I didn't know he'd succeeded." Delaney looked at her for a long moment. "Your father," he said, "was a thorough man." "Yes," she said. "He was." Delaney put his spectacles back on. "The deed filed by James Whitmore in August of 1878 is valid," he said. The territorial sale conducted by Victor Hale in September of 1878 is not only fraudulent, it was executed with full awareness of an existing federal deed, which constitutes knowing fraud against the United States federal land system. He looked at Ethan. "Mr. Callahan, your deposition regarding Mr. Whitmore's condition and location on the 14th of September is consistent with everything else in this file." "It's the truth," Ethan said. "I believe you." Delaney folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Whitmore, do you wish to file a full criminal complaint against Victor Hale for federal land fraud?" The room was very quiet. Clara sat in the federal building in Denver in her work coat and her calloused hands and thought about a question she had already answered. "Yes," she said. Delaney opened his desk drawer and produced a form. "Then, let's begin," he said. They stayed 2 nights in Denver. The first night, Clara sat in the boarding house room and wrote a letter to Bessie. He told her what had happened. She told her about the federal deed. She told her that the Whitmore land was legally hers and had been for almost a year, and that the case against Hale was now in federal hands, and that she thought she believed that it was going to hold. She held the pen over the paper for a long time at the end. Then she wrote, "I think I'm coming home. Both homes, maybe. I'll explain when I get back." She sealed the letter. She sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and knocked on the door of the room at the end of the hall. Ethan opened it. He looked at her. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to say it before I lose my nerve." Stepped back and let her in. She stood in the center of the small room, and he stood a few feet away, and she looked at him directly the way she'd looked at things her whole life, without flinching, without softening the edges, without making it smaller than it was. "I came up to your ranch because I had nowhere else to go," she said. That was the truth, and I won't pretend otherwise. And I stayed because the wages were fair and the work was real, and I needed the time to figure out the land question. She took a breath. "Those things are still true, and they're not the whole truth anymore." Ethan was very still. "I trust you," she said. "I don't say that to most people. I don't say it because I don't mean it when I do. But I trust you, and I'm aware that I've been waiting for a reason not to, and the reasons keep not coming, and at some point a person has to be honest about what that means." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said. "Let me finish." He waited. "I know you came to that gathering because my father asked you to look after me," she said. "And I know you'd say now that it turned into something different, that you meant what you said in the shack, that it's not about the promise anymore." "I believe you." She paused. "But I need you to understand that I'm not choosing you because I need looking after. I'm done needing looking after. The land is mine, the case is filed. I have for the first time in a very long time a future that I can see the shape of." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing you because you stood beside me, not in front. Not behind. Beside. And because you've never once looked at me like I was something to be managed." The silence was complete. Ethan crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face, her real face, the face she'd stopped hiding weeks ago with the same expression he'd been turning toward her for months, the one she'd finally stopped, pretending she didn't understand. Lifted one hand and set it very carefully against her jaw. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I told you that a long time ago." "I know," she said. "I'm just making sure you meant it." Meant it. She put her hand over his. She wasn't afraid. She had been afraid of so many things for so long that the absence of it felt enormous, like a room she'd expected to find crowded that turned out to be wide and open and full of light. All right, she said softly. All right, he said. Victor Hale was arrested on a Thursday in August. Federal marshals came to Red Hollow on a morning that Clara later heard described by 4 different people in 4 different ways, all of which agreed on the central facts, and 2 federal marshals rode in before breakfast, went directly to Hale's office on the main street, and walked out with him, between them 15 minutes later. He had his coat on, he was not in handcuffs, but he was not given a choice about the direction of travel. Clara heard about it from Bessie, who heard about it from the trading post, who heard about it from the man who had been sweeping his step when the marshals rode through. She was standing at the northeast fence line, the same fence line she'd repaired in her first week, held now, solid and tight through everything of the summer had thrown at it, with her skirt came running across the skirt held up, and her face doing 6 things at once. He's gone, Bessie said, slightly breathless. They took him. Clara set down the fence tool. She stood there for a moment. She thought about her father. She thought about February standing in that room, in Red Hollow, with the doctor's voice still in the air and her father's hands gone cold, and every wall pressing in. And Victor Hale's man at the door the very next morning, with papers about the debt, as if he'd been waiting in the hall. She thought about ash on her face and scissors on a floor and a line of women along a fence in the July heat. She thought about a tall, quiet man in a worn leather vest, looking at her calloused hands and saying, I don't need someone pretty. I need someone who can survive. She looked at Bessie. Is he coming back, she said. Not if the federal court does what everyone thinks it's going to do, Bessie said. Nodded. She picked the fence tool back up. Bessie stared at her. That's it, Bessie said. That's your reaction? You just picked the tool back up? Fence isn't finished, Clara said. Bessie made a sound that was somewhere between exasperation and admiration. Clara Whitmore, she said. You are the most. The south corner still needs shoring, Clara said. You want to hold the guideline or not? Bessie held the guideline. They worked the fence through the afternoon. The 2 of them, while the summer sun moved across the mountain sky and the children played in the yard, and somewhere far below in the valley, a chapter closed. Ethan came back from his 3rd trip to Red Hollow in 2 weeks with a different quality in his face, the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just set it down. Found Clara in the barn. He said Henderson came to see me today. She kept working. What did Henderson want, she said. Apologize. He said he understood now what Hale had done. Said he was sorry he'd pulled the grazing agreement. Another pause. Said he hoped we could go back to doing business. I said I'd think about it. Clara stopped working. She turned around. You'd think about it, she said. A man who folds that easy once will fold again, Ethan said. I'd rather know what I'm working with before I commit to anything. He leaned against the stall. But probably yes, eventually. People aren't all the way one thing or another. She looked at him. You sound like someone I used to know, she said. He raised an eyebrow. My father, she said. He used to say, don't write a man off for being afraid. Write him off for staying afraid. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Your father was smart, he said. She said. He also made mistakes and tried to fix them, and loved the people around him better than he loved himself, which is both a flaw and a gift depending on the day. She turned back to the work in her hands. That letter he filed, she said. The federal deed. He must have known what it would mean for me. He had to have known that if anything happened to him, if Hale moved, he filed it so I'd have a path. Even if I didn't know I had it, he knew you'd find it, Ethan said. He knew you'd fight. He asked a stranger to look after me, she said. Filed a secret deed with a federal agent. He told me to promise I wouldn't let Hale touch the land. She shook her head slowly. He was fighting for me right up to the end, even when he didn't have anything left to fight with. What people do, Ethan said quietly, for the ones they love. They use whatever they have left. Clara was still for a moment. Then she said, he would have liked you. It was the truest thing she had said in months. Ethan looked at her. I know, he said. I liked him. They stood in the barn in the late afternoon light. Two people who had come to each other the long way around through grief and fraud, and mountain trails and federal offices and a storm shelter, and a terrible gathering in July, and who were standing, now, on the same ground. Ground that was theirs. "Ethan," she said. "Clara." He looked at her. "On the mountain," she said. "My land is down in the valley, and I'll need to deal with it, rebuild the ranch house. Clear the debts that were legitimate, figure out what's salvageable. I'm staying on the mountain." She met his eyes. "If that's what you want." He crossed the barn in 4 steps. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to read around the one that said everything he was too careful to rush into saying, the one she had been seeing for months in the space between sentences, in the moments when he thought she wasn't watching. "It's what I want," he said. "Good," she said. She reached up and straightened the collar of his vest, a small, precise personal gesture that surprised them both with how natural it was. "The fence still needs 2 more stakes," she said. "It'll hold till morning," he said. She let her hand drop. She didn't step back. "Supper in 20 minutes," she said. "I'll be there," he said. She walked out of the barn. Nay, she didn't look back, but she was smiling by the time she reached the house, small and real and entirely her own, the way things were real when they hadn't been performed or forced or earned, through suffering alone, but through the patient, daily accumulation of choosing to stay, choosing to fight, choosing to let someone stand beside you instead of making yourself carry everything alone. She was smiling, and the mountain held everything, the way it always had, solid beneath her feet. The south fence held through August. It held through the first cold snap that came down off the high ridge in the second week of September, and it held through the wind that followed 3 days after that, the kind of wind that tested everything on the mountain fences. Roofs. Resolve and separated what had been built right from what had only looked right. Clara noticed this about the mountain. It didn't care about appearances. It only cared about what was true. She had started to think of it as home. Not in the way she had thought of her father's ranch as home that was love deep and rooted and full of childhood and memory. This was different. This was chosen. This was a place she had come to by accident and stayed in by decision, and the difference between those two things was the difference between belonging and ownership. Belonged here. She had decided to. The letter from the Federal Land Commission arrived on a Tuesday in late September, and it said, in the careful formal language of institutions that had learned to say large things in small words, that the investigation into the sale of the Whitmore property had concluded. The sale had been found fraudulent on 3 separate counts. That Victor Hale had been referred to federal prosecution. And that the Whitmore property, by virtue of the valid federal deed filed by James Whitmore in August of 1878, was confirmed in its entirety as the legal property of Clara Ann Whitmore, free and clear of any territorial claim or debt arrangement. At the kitchen table. Ethan was across from her, watching her face. She set the letter down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "It's done. All of it," he said. "All of it." He was quiet. She looked up and found him watching her with that expression, the one she had stopped trying to look away from months ago, the one that had nothing in it except the specific truth of what she meant to him, unperformed and unguarded. "My father did it," she said. "In the end, he filed that deed and it held, and it was enough." She pressed one hand flat on the letter. "You did it," Ethan said. "You carried the letter for 8 months. You stood your ground in that yard when Hale came. You rode to Buena Vista and you went to Denver and you filed the complaint." He held her gaze. "James Whitmore gave you the tools. You built the case." She looked at him for a long moment. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision in February and kept it through everything, and she was going to keep it now. It was close. "I want to go down to the ranch," she said. "Whitmore Ranch." "I know," he said. "Will you come with me?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Without a single qualification. Just yes. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She said, We go tomorrow. They rode down to the valley in the early morning, just the two of them, and the trail was familiar now, in a way it had not been 4 months ago, when Clara had ridden up it for the first time on a roan mare named June, carrying ash on her face, and a dead man's letter in her saddlebag, and exactly nothing she could call certainty. She knew every bend now. She knew where the trail dropped and where it opened, and where the creek crossing ran shallow in September versus how it ran in July. She knew this mountain the way she'd known her father's ranch in her body, not just her mind. Whitmore property sat 3 miles east of Red Hollow, and they came at it from the north field, which Clara had not seen in nearly a year. She pulled June up at the fence line and looked. The house was still standing. That surprised her. She had half expected Hale to have done something to it, torn it down, stripped it, turned it into something unrecognizable. But it was standing, though it had the particular look of a place that had been left alone for too long. The kitchen garden was gone to weeds. The fence lines needed work. The barn door hung at an angle that told her the top hinge had given out. The bones were good. Her father had built good bones. She sat on June and looked at it and felt something move through her chest that was not grief exactly and not joy exactly, but some specific combination of the two that she had no clean word for. Nah. Something that said, this is real, and it is yours, and the person who made it loved you enough to fight for it even when he had nothing left to fight with. Needs work, Ethan said beside her. Everything worth having does, she said. He looked at her. That's your father talking, he said. She said. They sat there for another moment. Then Clara clicked her tongue and June walked forward through the gate, and she rode onto her own land for the first time in a year, and the ground was solid under the mare's feet, and it was hers. She didn't move back immediately. This surprised people. It surprised Bessie, who had assumed that the return of the land meant the return to the land, and who said so directly at supper 3 days after the letter arrived. On back, Bessie said. I'm going to fix it up, Clara said. I'm going to repair it, and make it right and figure out what it can be. But I'm not, no. She looked at her plate. I'm not going to live there alone. Bessie looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his coffee. Hey, the ranch can run as a satellite property, Clara said, with the particular tone of someone who has thought this through and is now explaining a decision they've already made. I can run cattle on the lower pasture, lease the north field to the Hendersons if they want it on my terms, with my agreement, with a clause that lets me pull out if they don't hold up their end. It doesn't need to be lived in to be worked. And you'll live here, Bessie said. I'll live here, Clara said. Bessie looked at Ethan again. This time Ethan looked up. Bessie, he said mildly. I didn't say a word, Bessie said. You were about to say several. I was going to say that I think that's a fine decision, Bessie said with great dignity. I was going to say nothing else. Good, Clara said. I was also going to say that Thomas has been asking if he can help with the Whitmore repairs, because he wants to learn carpentry and the barn hinge is the kind of job that teaches you things. Clara looked across the table at Thomas. He had developed it over the course of the summer, the specific brand of 12-year-old dignity that meant he was deeply interested in this conversation and trying very hard to appear otherwise. Want to learn carpentry? She said. Yes, ma'am, he said. You'd have to do it right. No cutting corners on the structural work. No, ma'am, and you'd have to carry your own tools. I've got tools, he said. Then, slightly less certain, I can get tools. Ethan said, without looking up from his coffee, there's a spare set in the barn. He heard Hook on the left. Thomas was out of his chair and heading for the door before the sentence was fully finished. Bessie watched him go. She looked at Ethan. She said very quietly, thank you. Ethan said, the tools were just sitting there. They both knew that was not what she was thanking him for. The work on the Whitmore ranch began the following Monday, and it became, in ways Clara had not anticipated, the project that changed everything. Not just the property, everything. Word got out the way everything got out in frontier territory. through a chain of conversations that moved faster than written correspondence ever could, that Clara Whitmore was rebuilding her father's ranch with her own hands, and a mountain cowboy, and a widow's 12-year-old boy, and that the Federal Land Commission had ruled in her favor, and that Victor Hale was facing prosecution in a Denver court. Not many at first. Mrs. Hargrove from the boarding house rode out on the third day with a basket of food and stayed to help with the kitchen garden, working alongside Clara for 4 hours without being asked and without making a production of it. Just two women on their knees in the dirt pulling weeds. The Hendersons sent their youngest son with a message saying they'd heard the north fence needed rails, and they had timber they weren't using. Bessie's neighbor from her old street in Red Hollow, a woman Clara had met exactly twice, showed up with her husband, and they spent a Saturday rehanging the barn door. Clara stood back at the end of that Saturday and watched people she barely knew loading their tools back into wagons and saying goodnight, and she felt something she didn't immediately have the language for. Then she did. She felt what it meant to be part of something. Not property, not a problem, not a transaction. Part of something. She went to find Ethan. He was at the fence line, finishing the last of the North Rail work with Thomas, both of them moving with the easy coordination of people who had been Ethan's long enough to not need to talk through it. She stood and watched them for a moment, the man and the boy, the work between them, and she thought about what it cost a person to give that. Not money, not effort, attention. The specific, irreplaceable attention of someone who believed the work mattered and believed the person doing it mattered more. Ethan looked up. "Done for the day," he said. "Done for the day," she said. He said something to Thomas, who nodded and started toward the barn. Ethan walked to Clara. He stopped beside her and looked at the fence line. "Looks right," he said. "It does," she said. They stood together in the early evening quiet of her father's property, her property, and she thought about James Whitmore working this same fence line 100 times, 1,000 times, over the 30 years he'd run this ranch. She thought about his hands on the same posts. She thought about him teaching her to do it right when she was small enough that the tools were too heavy, and she had to use both hands and lean her whole weight into it. She thought about a man she had never been able to properly grieve because she had been too busy surviving to stop and feel it. She felt it now. "I missed him," she said. Her voice was quiet and even the same voice she used for true things. Ethan stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He reached over and took her hand. Just that. She held on. She looked at the fence line her father had built, and the fence line she had rebuilt, and the way they ran together now, old work and new work, into the same horizon. She didn't let go. The trial was in November. Victor Hale stood before a federal judge in Denver, and the case against him was, as Gerald Marsh had predicted in his Garden Gun Wild house in Buena Vista, solid. 3 counts of federal land fraud, 1 count of knowing misrepresentation to a territorial court, 1 count of intimidation of a federal's witness, that one stemming from the morning on the mountain trail, the 2 hired men, the court order that had been real but applied to a fraudulent judgment. And Clara gave her deposition in a room that smelled of ink and floor polish, sitting across a table from a federal attorney who asked her the same question 6 different ways to make sure every answer was watertight. And she answered every one of them clearly, and without embellishment and without looking away. Ethan gave his testimony about September 14th, 1878, the Platte River, James Whitmore too sick to hold a pen, 200 miles from Red Hollow. Gerald Marsh presented the documentation. The federal judge looked at all of it over the course of 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, he delivered his finding. Clara sat in the federal courtroom in Denver, in her best dress, which was not a fancy dress. It was a well-made practical dress in dark blue wool that she had bought the day before, because Bessie had told her she was not going into a federal courtroom in her work clothes, and she had conceded the point, and she listened to the judge read through the finding in his careful, measured voice, and she felt Ethan's hand on the bench beside her, and close but not touching, available. She reached over and put her hand on his. He turned his palm up. The judge said guilty on all counts. The judge said, "The Whitmore deed is confirmed, and any further challenge to its validity shall be considered contempt of federal court." Judge said, "Victor Hale is remanded to federal custody pending sentencing." The courtroom made sound. Clara made no sound. She sat very still and held Ethan's hand and looked at the front of the room and thought about her father. Nay, she thought about him asking a stranger to look after his daughter. She thought about him filing a deed in her name with a federal agent because he knew the system could be corrupted, but believed that if you went high enough, if you went federal, there was still something that held. He had been right, Clara, Ethan said low and close. She looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something large and choosing to be careful with it. "It's over," he said. She said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I can breathe all the way," she said. He squeezed her hand. She let herself have the moment. All of it. They were back on the mountain by the end of the week. November had settled in properly now, the high country already carrying the early edge of winter, the air thin and cold and clean, in a way that lowland air never quite managed. And Clara came out of the house in the pre-dawn and stood in the yard and breathed it, and felt it move through her all the way to her bones. He had a decision to make. She had been carrying it for 2 weeks, since Denver, since the verdict. Since the specific moment when everything she had been fighting toward had been achieved, and she had stood up from that courtroom bench and realized that the future was no longer a problem to be solved. It was a question to be answered. She found Ethan at the barn. He was feeding the horses his morning routine, the same one she had walked into 4 months ago in the pre-dawn dark when she hadn't known yet what she was walking into. She stood in the doorway. "I need to ask you something," she said. He kept work. "Go ahead." "The Whitmore Ranch," she said. "I've been thinking about what to do with it, long term." She paused. "I don't want to lease it out. I don't want to sit on it and let it go to weeds. I want it to be something." "What kind of something?" She had thought about this carefully. She had turned it over for 2 weeks and looked at it from every angle, and she was certain. "A way station," she said. "For women who need somewhere to land." She watched his face. "The frontier's full of them. Women like Bessie was like I was. Women who've lost property through fraud or been abandoned or had their options taken. There's nowhere for them to go. The church turns them away if they don't fit the right story. The town looks at them the way Red Hollow looked at me." She held his gaze. "My father's ranch has a solid house and good land, and it's on a federal deed that can't be touched. I want to use it for something real." Ethan had stopped feeding June. He was looking at her. "That's a big undertaking," he said. "I know. You'd need help. Money. People you could trust to run it when you're not there." "I know," Bessie has said. She almost smiled. "That's what I thought too." He turned back to June and was quiet for a moment. "You'd be splitting yourself between 2 properties," he said. "A ranch and here. Yes, that's a hard way to live." "I've lived harder." He looked at her over June's back. "You're not asking my permission," he said. "No," she said. "I'm telling you what I've decided. And I'm asking you to tell me if this is something you can be part of. Because I want to build this with you beside me, not around you." The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the yard with the particular tone it had in November lower, the steadier, no longer the bright summer wind, but something older and more serious. Ethan came around June and walked to the doorway where Clara stood. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, her real face, the one she had been wearing openly since the day she'd washed the ash away, with the expression that had stopped being difficult to read the moment she stopped needing it to be difficult. "There's something I've been carrying for a while," he said. Waited. He reached into his vest. He produced a ring. It was not fancy. It was a plain silver band, worn slightly at the edges in the way of a thing that had been handled many times. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me when I left home at 18. She said, 'Keep this until you find someone worth keeping.'" He met her eyes. "Been carrying it for 20 years. I didn't think I was going to find that person. A pause. I was wrong. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about the gathering in Red Hollow. She thought about ash and scissors, and a coat 2 sizes too big. She thought about the end of the line and a man who had stopped in front of her and said, "I don't need someone pretty. I need someone who can survive." She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately. To be chosen for the right reasons. To have someone stand beside you, not in front, not behind, and stay. "Ethan," she said. "You can say no," he steady. "Honest. I mean everything I said in that barn last summer." "You're free. Whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere. Work stands regardless." "I know that," she said. "Then, you know this isn't me trying to claim you," he said. Me asking. "If you want to build something, that's ours. The mountain and the valley ranch and whatever comes next. Together." She looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about her father saying, "Don't let Hale touch this land. Nah, don't let him touch you." She thought about what she'd built instead. In spite of everything, the land reclaimed, the fraud exposed, the future she could see the shape of. She thought about Bessie's children doing their schoolwork at the kitchen table, and Thomas learning to use a fence lever from his wrist, and Ruth explaining Margaret's adventures to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. She thought about being part of something. She reached out. She took the ring from his palm. She held it for a moment. Then she held it back out to him. He looked at her. "Put it on me," she said. Something moved across his face, brief and enormous, and quickly gathered back to its usual steadiness, but she caught it, the way she caught everything about him now. He took the ring, he took her hand, he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. The things that were right always did. She looked at it on her hand. She looked at him. "The way station was going to be called the Whitmore House," she said. "I'm keeping the name. The land is still my father's land." She paused. "But I think the woman running it might have a different name." Ethan looked at her. "Clara Callahan," he said quietly. "Clara Whitmore Callahan," she said, "both. He deserves to be remembered." "Yes," Ethan said. The winter came down hard that year. December brought 3 feet of snow on the high ridge, and temperatures that sent the ranch animals deep into the barn, and kept everyone close to the fire in the evenings. It was the kind of winter that tested character and revealed it, that stripped away everything that wasn't necessary and left only what was real. What was real on Ethan Callahan's mountain ranch in the winter of 1879 was this: a man and a woman who had found each other the long way around. A widow rebuilding her life in a bunkhouse that had been converted, gradually and without announcement, into something that looked more like a home every week. 3 children who had started the summer with nothing and were ending it with a kitchen table and a place to sleep, and a 12-year-old boy who could now replace a fence hinge properly and knew it. What was real was the Whitmore House, which opened in the spring on the Valley Ranch with Bessie Crane as its superintendent, and 2 women in the first month and 4 in the second, and a small but growing reputation among the Frontier Network's church. Women, midwives, trading post operators, as a place where a woman in trouble could go and be received without judgment and without a price. What was real was Clara, who rode between the mountain and the valley, twice a week through the spring, overseeing both, moving between both lives with the ease of someone who had stopped pretending that existing in one place required erasing another. She was the mountain and the valley both. She had always been both. She just knew it now. What was real was the conversation she had with Mrs. Hargrove in May, standing in the kitchen of the Whitmore house. When the older woman said, "You know what I thought when you walked into that gathering last July with ash on your face?" "What?" Clara said. "I thought that girl's going to either destroy herself or change everything, Mrs." Hargrove looked at her. "I'm glad it was the second one." Clara looked around the kitchen, the clean surfaces, the orderly shelves, the sound of children from the next room, the particular quality of a space that had been given a new purpose. "My father built this kitchen," she said. "I know, Mrs." Grove said, "He'd like what it's for now. I think he'd like you, Mrs. Ergrove said. If he could see what you became. Clara was quiet for a moment. He saw it, she said. He told a stranger on a river that his daughter was the most capable person he'd ever known. She straightened a jar on the shelf. He saw it. In June, exactly 1 year after the gathering at Red Hollow, Clara stood on the north ridge of Ethan's Mountain and looked out at the valley below. Summer was back, the air was warm and bright, and full of the particular quality of a high-country July impossible blue sky, wind that came and went like conversation, the smell of everything growing because it finally could. She heard Ethan come up behind her. He stopped beside her. They looked at the valley. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she said. You walked into that gathering with ash on your face, and your hair cut off, and your coat 2 sizes too big, he said, and you stood at the end of that line like you were ready to fight the world alone. I was ready to fight the world alone, she said. I know, he said. That's why I stopped. She looked at him. You told me you needed someone who could survive, she said. You told me you weren't interested in being chosen. I wasn't. You changed your mind. You gave me a reason to, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her. The June light was on his face, and his eyes were steady and clear, and full of everything she had stopped being afraid to look at. Clara Whitmore Callahan, he said. Ethan Callahan, she said. You know what I think about? Tell me. Your father, he said. In that river. Sick and scared, and using the last of what he had to ask a stranger to look after someone he loved. He looked out at the valley. It would work. He couldn't have known. He just believed that if he used what he had, that if he kept fighting with whatever was left, something would hold. Clara looked at the valley. She thought about James Whitmore in the Platte River. She thought about a letter filed with a federal agent in August of 1878. She thought about a ring carried for 20 years in a vest pocket, waiting for the right person. She thought about the things people did for love when love was all they had left to do anything with. Something held, she said. Something held, he said. She reached over and took his hand. He held it the way he held everything she gave him, carefully, completely, without pretending it cost him nothing. The summer spread out below them, the valley and the mountain, and the ranch and the Whitmore house and everything built and rebuilt and still standing, the way things stood when they'd been built right and built together. And Clara Whitmore Callahan stood on her mountain with her husband beside her, and the wind in her face and the whole long future opening out ahead, like land she hadn't mapped yet but knew bone deep, and certain she had the strength to work. She had always had the strength. She just needed someone to stand beside her long enough that she stopped having to prove it to herself first. It was love, not a rescue, not a surrender, not a transaction or an arrangement or a claim filed on another person's life. Just 2 people, choosing the same ground, standing on it together, and holding,